Okay, now having looked at social class structure in Europe in the 17th century, we focused on the relationship between the nobility and upper classes overall and the peasants beneath them, um, paternalism and deference, the relationship there, and also the arrival of the kind of new up and coming middle class merchants and capitalists and how they kind of fit into the picture. Now we're going to round things out by looking at kind of everyday life for your average, say, farmer. For the most part. So we talked about yeoman farmers in England. We're kind of focusing on this group now, just to give us a sense of what social life was like in the average town or village in England, France, etc. Professor Buchholz, again, we've been relying on heavily here, says despite inflation, most people were living lives of greater material comfort than had their ancestors. This period saw the great rebuilding of houses. One and two room huts were being replaced by more substantial dwellings designed to last more than one generation. Lesser gentry, yeomen, and substantial husbandmen began to build multi-roomed houses of timber frame with an infill of plaster or brick. Even the humble farmer slept on beds with mattresses and pillows, abandoned wooden plates for tin, pewter, and silver. The diet consisted for the well-off of meat and fish, wheaten bread, a variety of dairy products, beer, and wine. By most well-off, he means the most well-off among the peasant farmers. Most days, the lower orders consumed simple rye bread, bacon, porridge, cheese, milk, and beer. I could live on that. That doesn't sound too bad to me. Bacon, cheese, milk, and beer, I'd be pretty much set. That's a pretty high standard of living for peasant farmers. Now, again, that's coming from England. And in France and Germany, it probably was a little less true, but not by a lot. Even during good times, the text goes on to say, no one could depend on a long and healthy life. Early modern people lacked modern understandings of hygiene, nutrition, and disease, were prone to sudden accident, and survived at the mercy of the elements. Frequent occurrences of plague, influenza, typhoid, fever, cholera, whooping cough, fevers, fluxes, agues, and mysterious afflictions like griping of the guts. Griping, that was actually a term used, griping of the guts. Doesn't sound good or pleasant to be sure. So standard of living was certainly, I think, rising somewhat for the people kind of peasant but middling backgrounds, but life could still be extremely difficult because of disease, lack of medical care in the way we think of it today, lack of understanding of hygiene and nutrition in the way we think of it today, and kind of how that caused some of the problems. Poverty and charity. There weren't welfare states in those days whereby the government had programs, no unemployment insurance, no disability pensions, no retirements or social security, nothing like that anywhere. The idea was unheard of. And to However, society tended to sort of chip in, communities, towns, neighbors, to try to take care of those sort of living sort of hand to mouth on the edge of existence in poverty, homeless, people who were down on their luck in one or more ways. So, what are sometimes referred to as institutions of civil society, or uh, institutions that are private, not government run, but nonetheless serve these kind of important functions of taking care of those unable to take care of themselves. Oftentimes, this is done by churches, Catholic Church in Catholic countries, other Protestant churches in those type of countries. Jeffrey Parker, who I've quoted already, his book on the global crisis of the 17th century, said the number of those living on the edge of poverty had increased significantly during the 16th century. The proportion of registered poor in the Italian city of Cremona, for instance, tripled between 1550 and 1600. In Antwerp and Lyon, two of the largest cities in Western Europe, by 1600, 3/4 of the total population were too poor to pay tax and likely to need relief in times of crisis. Some possessed not a single piece of furniture, not a chair, table, bed, etc., while others lacked a permanent shelter, sleeping in a barn or an attic in winter, under a hedgerow in summer. Most of these poor families relied for their survival on finding work from others. A bad harvest, leading to dear food and little work, could swiftly bring economic disaster. Recorded suicides rose notably during economic recessions. Hardship affected women the worst, children as well. 2/3 of those on welfare were women, the majority of them widows. Indeed, the commonest single cause of destitution was death or desertion of a family's breadwinner. It says on welfare. Sometimes that means sort of private welfare, again, private charity. But England was the one country that did have something akin to a welfare system already, sort of a form of public poor relief. So they had, to some degree, that was already there in England, but nowhere else. So again, the plight of the poor, the homeless, those unable to care for themselves, really was sort of in the lap of the people in cities and their sense of charity and certain, as I said, institutions of civil society of a private nature, like private hospitals, etc., orphanages that did some of this work long before there were really modern type government programs to do so. Vagrancy and crime, not that they always went together, but they sometimes did. And vagrancy was a huge problem in France, in England, sort of all over in the 17th century, partly because of the changes taking place economically that left more and more people out of work, kicked off the land, driven off the land, usually legally if it was Western Europe, sometimes illegally if it was further to the east. There's been lots of debate among scholars about what caused crime. There is even to this day about what causes it today. And there's certainly some reason to believe that people living in poverty, people that were, say, vagrants, homeless, would be more inclined to steal and to commit certain crimes, crimes of property, because of the poverty that they were living in, the difficult conditions. But I don't think that explains all of it. So there is, again, some disagreement ongoing amongst scholars. There certainly were uprisings and law, as I say, and disorder sometimes. There certainly was plenty of law and order as well. But in the 17th century, even into the 18th century in Europe, and you see it in the American colonies as well, there was a certain sense in which at least a small amount of rebellion was seen as, at the very least, tolerable. Thomas Jefferson, in the colonies in the 18th century, so a little bit later, said famously, "A little rebellion now and then is a good thing," which, coming from one of the mover and shaker, most powerful, important leaders in America at the time, that's saying something. He's talking about saying revolution, rebellion anyway, is a good thing. What did he mean by this? So here's at the top of the screen, the slide, the social value of tumult. Tumult means kind of disorder, tumultuousness. Right? It means things are sort of topsy-turvy. So what could Jefferson have meant? Basically saying that to the people, if you rebel within limits, right, don't cause too much damage and violence, then we can be lenient with punishments. But if you go too far, then there's going to be trouble. Furthermore, Jefferson was saying, and others like him certainly in Europe, even in the century before, which is this century, the 17th, that they're saying in a sense that allowing the public kind of a little safety valve, releasing of, letting off some steam now and then, is sort of better than, cracking down on every little thing, and then the steam that they blow off later on is sort of built up under much bigger pressure. So better to let it out in small doses now and then. And so they kill a government official, or at least beat them up in the streets now and then. It keeps the government honest. As part of it as well. Jefferson was sort of saying that nothing will keep your city government more honest than fear of being stabbed with a pitchfork by angry farmers if you do something they don't like. So this was seen in those days as still kind of acceptable. But there was kind of a trade-off here, much like the paternalism from above, deference from below kind of thing. You rebel within limits, and we'll be lenient with the punishments. As Professor Parker says, most popular revolts began with rumors concerning a threat to one of life's necessities: food, jobs, welfare, traditional rights. Then an incident caused anger and anxiety to boil over into violence and provoked attempts to eliminate an individual identified as the cause. At this stage, women, often older women, often played a prominent role, advancing on their target with aprons full of stones and yelling slogans. During a riot in a Dutch city over a new duty or tax on turf, which was a type of fuel for heat, a group of women attacked the chief tax collector, shouting, "Let's send our men home and get the bastard. We'll beat him up because we cannot be punished we can't be punished for fighting." I guess there were no laws, against women fighting, because it didn't happen all that often, or at least until this period. When the authorities made immediate concessions, the troubles usually petered out. But attempts to punish troublemakers often provoked greater violence, which only troops from the central government could suppress. Hence, the kind of trade-off deal made: you rebel within limits, we'll allow you to do it now and then if it'll cause too much damage, and we'll be lenient with the punishments. But if you go too far, if you cross the line, it was kind of a feel situation. Let's kind of feel this out with what's acceptable to the authorities that's not crossing the line or right up to the line behind. This was, I'm sure, different in different places. There was no hard and fast rule, but they came to kind of an informal agreement, right? So both sides saw it in their interest, their self-interest, to kind of make this unwritten deal. Popular culture and control from above. I'm not saying this is the only explanation for the uses of popular culture. It's certainly not. But I'm not going to read these either for reasons of time. But suffice it to say, if you read these quotes here from a couple of different sources, we can see that popular culture, various public entertainments, had a social function to them. And it's something that's talked about by historians in many different societies and times and places in society. Women, family life, village, parish communities. On the left, you see some famous paintings of Dutch middle class folk in the 17th century. Robert Buchholz, yet again, we've learned that while women were responsible for the household, this brought them into the world when they wielded the sickle beside their men at harvest time, when they went to market to purchase food and to sell surplus butter, eggs, poultry, etc., and when they worked next to their men in urban shops at the front of their houses. Often, when their husbands and fathers died, urban women were pulled further into the public sphere of business to run these shops. A single woman was able to buy and sell property, contract debts, and engage in trade. Like most working mothers today, such women were still expected to perform their domestic duties as well, cooking, sewing, spinning, washing, and cleaning for their families when they stood at their front doors. When they stood at their front doors or in the market, arms folded, discussing the affairs of the neighborhood, women were not just gossiping. They were regulating communal moral standards, enforcing neighborliness, and holding reputations up to approval or scorn based on how other women ran their households and sex lives. During the political tensions of the 17th century, he's talking about, again, England here specifically, women joined in presenting petitions to Parliament. They were neither merely victims nor decorative adornments. They had agency, meaning they had the ability to act and to take matters into their own hands, not just sort of sit back and have to kind of take what was given to them, playing an active role in the world. Now, Buchholz is certainly aware, as he alludes in this passage to, alludes to in this passage, that women, of course, didn't have the same rights as men. It was still a patriarchal, misogynist society. But he does point out, I think, aptly, that women didn't just sit around taking orders from their husbands. They had an assertive role to play, and were assertive about it. Partly because society functioned, that way. Didn't function if women didn't play these roles. As far as marriage, patriarchy, the family go, families again came in many forms. One of the things that sort of has been debated over decades now of research and writing on families in 17th century Europe is how they treated children. It's often been claimed on one side of the research that children were treated horribly by today's standards. But that's been challenged, particularly in recent years. And we might be sort of looking back on the 17th century and expecting their family lives to look like ours and missing some signs of love and affection and concern for children that we miss because we don't sort of think of it or don't do it that way today. There's also been quite a bit of scholarship about the difference between the way elite, wealthy families brought their children up and the way that the poor did. And one thing that comes across there is that the elite often treated their children worse than the poor, sending them off to boarding school all the time and sort of not being there for their kids. Or the poor had no choice but to be there for their kids. They could be nowhere else, or they could send their kids nowhere else. So in many ways, it does appear that the lower classes took better care of their children and gave them more love and attention than the upper class folks. But there's, as Buchholz here says, there's evidence that non-elite parents, meaning not the rich, did love and to some extent indulge their children. They tended to be nursed kids for as long as 3 years and reared at least until adolescence by their own parents. This physical proximity may have encouraged a psychological closeness lacking among the landed elite. So just the reality, physical reality of being in the presence of your kids and vice versa, basically all day, every day, because you couldn't afford to live in, separate places and live in one small hovel of an apartment or home, lent itself to closeness. Certainly, it lent itself to abuse as well if the husband happened to be an abusive sort. But nonetheless, there's somewhat of a contrast between the way the rich dealt with their children and the way that the poor did. And the victory, from our perspective, the kudos go to the poor, not the rich. Reproduction and children. Reproductive history is a fascinating study, at least going through the ages, through the decades and centuries. As Bonnie Smith says in Changing Lives, Women in European History, reproduction has a history that is cultural and economic as well as natural. Pregnancies had political and economic repercussions, thus a major social concern throughout history. Rural families in the countryside monitored fecundity and sterility alike as part of their effort to ensure familial community survival. For this reason, customs and rituals developed around childbirth, as did myths, superstitions, and storytelling. Reproduction formed a set of social practices directed by community life and inherited wisdom. So, passed down traditional wisdom from one generation to the next. These practices worked on the individual mother to give the experience of childbirth in those days its unique historic shape. Childbirth itself was precarious, so rural women had to produce enough children to ensure family survival. 50% of children did not survive to adulthood. 50%. It's frightening. I mean, imagine the amount of just heartache that must have existed like all the time, because half of your offspring, or your siblings, if you were a kid, didn't live to adulthood. Infertile women kissed church door locks that symbolized opening and closing of birth passages, made special devotions, pilgrimages in order to get pregnant. So these are all kinds of myths and superstitions designed to sort of deal with problems of infertility. Where prosperity from better farming techniques resulted in better health and lower infant mortality, families lowered the number of children desired. So this is something that's true in the modern world as well. It wasn't too many decades ago that there was a huge worry among lots of scientists that there was going to be a population explosion in the world that was going to cause misery and mass suffering and starvation, population bomb. But it didn't happen that way, and partly because the predictions were kind of inaccurate. And one of the main reasons is kind of what's being said here. That is that wealthier families, and as societies become more affluent, as wealth grows, standard of living rises in a society, people tend to have fewer children. Poorer families tend to have more children. Think of today when you have a husband and wife who are both career-oriented college graduates, maybe have advanced degrees. So, I don't know, the wife is a lawyer, the husband is a corporate executive, and they make a lot of money. They have lots of time. They have to commit to their careers, and so they have no kids or one kid or two kids. That's kind of the norm now in a modern society, and this is what has caused population in at least the wealthier countries of the world, like the U.S., to level off. There were contraceptive devices as far back as the 17th century, believe it or not. But some of these were kind of in the again the realm of kind of myths and superstitions. Not all of them, but some of them. So Professor Smith goes on to say, because reproduction influenced family survival, women worried whenever their pregnancy threatened to set the balance between resources and human claims on them. They took stern measures to prevent unwanted pregnancies. Oils, herbs, vegetable substances, or even animal parts were thought to induce abortions. You can see the various pressures of society sort of on reproduction in in early modern Europe. Kinship and neighborliness